down those cards.
Fortune teller!
Cards mean different things at different times.
Do you know anything about tarot cards?
Oh, a crystal ball.
Gather around, children.
Listen to the mystic.
Journey.
Podcast.
I'm no mystic.
Welcome to the Mystic Fool's Journey podcast. I'm Anna, and this is Ruth.
Hi.
This is a tarot, occult, history, bi-weekly podcast. Say that 5 times fast. We're taking a deep dive into the history of tarot, and we're talking origin stories, popular myths, and answering questions like, how did tarot become a tool for divination? So let's dive in.
Heck yeah, let's do it. Do you know anything specifically about the history of tarot in general? What's your familiarity level with this topic?
It's pretty like top level in terms of like, I know it was a game before it was a divination. You know, it's one of those like, yeah, it was probably a card game. I also know that in general, playing cards have existed for a long time and have been developed across different cultures in different ways. So like playing cards separate from divination have existed for a long time. And depending on where they developed, they might be older or younger or be slightly different. But it really is kind of like top level information like that. We're like, yeah, it was a game, but I don't know all the like ins and outs of how it got to its current state and what it took to get here.
Yeah, I think that's most tarot readers' general history level as well. I know that was definitely mine before starting to research this podcast. And you're right on the money there. Tarot was invented in Italy during the 15th century. Is that the 1400s for us timeline challenged?
Yeah. That seems right.
Okay, cool.
It's like you minus the number.
Yeah, exactly. It's one below plus 2 zeros.
Yeah.
That's the neurodivergent way to math it.
This is how we math. Yeah. 15th is actually 1400s. 17th is going to be 1600s. Yeah.
Right. We're all on the same page. It didn't start out as a tool for divination, but just as a regular old card game. But we can actually track tarot's original origin story back even farther than that. And to do so, we'll need to jump back in time another 100 years or so to the 13th century in Egypt and introduce ourselves to the Mamluks. Do you know who the Mamluks are?
I do not. This was the first time I've ever heard that phrase. Hopefully I'm not shaming my former history teachers in school by saying that, but I really don't remember learning about the Mamluks.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of them either before this, so I think we're all in the green there. So the Mamluks, the word Mamluk means owned in Arabic, because the Mamluks were a class of warrior enslaved people, mostly of Turkic or Caucasian ethnicity, who served between the 9th and the 19th century in the Islamic world. So pretty wide. Yeah,
that's a
range.
Long time period. I'm sure they have their own rich history that deserves its own podcast or at least a couple episodes at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Everybody should do a deep dive into the Mamluks. They're pretty crazy. A lot of people compare them to geishas, like super loosely, obviously.
Okay, yeah. I was like, how close?
Right. Yeah, so geishas were there to entertain wealthier people, but they still held high positions in society. And so it's similar to the Mamluks because the Mamluks were enslaved, but they could still hold high positions in society.
Interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. And their history is totally bonkers, and they were the key players in several historical events. These slave warriors of medieval Islam lists of accomplishments include overthrowing their masters, defeating the Mongols and the Crusaders, and then establishing a dynasty that lasted for 300 years.
Ooh, put that on a resume. I mean, oh my gosh.
Know.
Yeah, that's
overthrowing their masters.
Yeah, that's the first thing you always want to start with. That's always a good story, right?
Yeah, totally. So we're probably wondering what the heck do these guys have to do with tarot?
Yeah, 100%.
Well, cool to talk about. Let's bring it back to the original reason why we're here. We're talking about the Mamluks because they created the kind of primordial ancestor to the tarot deck. We call it the Mamluk playing card deck. We consider this to be the mother deck of tarot because it has many similarities to the first tarot decks in Italy.
When we're saying tarot deck, this is before we have any of the divination attachments to the tarot deck. It's more about like the structure of the deck that this is the predecessor to, like the numbers.
Absolutely, exactly.
Right.
Yep, it's just the actual structure. So basically, if we were to like think about tarot decks, like the structure of a tarot deck is, the major arcana and the suits, and 4 suits to be specific. So that's kind of what we're basing it off of. Like, we consider this to be the mother deck because it also has 4 suits in the deck: swords, coins, cups, and polo sticks. Apparently, polo was huge in the Mom Luke culture.
I have many questions about polo's history now because I did not realize how far back that went.
Right.
I did also notice in your previous, and like some of your notes when we were like first kind of discussing this, is that it's like their sword suit is scimitars, which is like a form of blade, but it's obviously scimitars are very specific to their culture and what kind of sword they were using, which I just thought was really interesting that, over time we've kind of like kept a similar vibe, but shifted the meaning based off of what culture was predominantly using it. Like, I'm sure there's an interesting story at some point about like why it went from polo sticks to wands or something. Probably for a later episode, though.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to be talking about that throughout this entire, length of the podcast. Because you can say that about basically any tarot card in the deck. Like, there's very few tarot cards that have, at least when it turned to divinatory purposes, there's very few tarot cards that have stayed same meaning, same imagery, same suit, same number, since like for the past 400 years or something, since we know tarot decks as they are now. We're going to be talking more about that in the future.
We're going to be untangling all the different changes as much as we can over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what you and I are most interested in. So we'll be there. We'll be camping out in that aspect of history for sure. In addition to the similar suits, there were also 13 cards per suit, the numbers 1 to 10 plus 3 court cards. So in addition to the suits, there were also 3 court cards, which is similar to how, the structure of a tarot deck is today. The court cards included the king, the lieutenant, the second lieutenant. So those are the 3 court cards, and they're all male. So no queens, no princesses, nothing of that sort
like
yet.
That. I do think it's super interesting that the names of them clearly correspond to, like, if we're talking about the Mamluks as this warrior group, obviously their court cards are showing off their army background, their warrior perspective, where you've got lieutenants and king, but we don't have things like a page or something like that,
Yeah, and I think that just goes to like another point too, this being the mother deck of all tarots for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, another very interesting aspect of the deck is that it actually doesn't depict human figure at all. Because in the Islamic tradition, you're not allowed to depict the human figure in art.
That is super interesting. When we mentioned this and I looked at that, I was like, I had to reach back in the recesses of my art history as well as some like religious history, because I wanted to do like a little overview. It's a very nuanced topic. Islamic religious art often avoids showing human figures, and sometimes even more broadly, any sentient figures like animals. And this is due to how specific passages in the Quran and the Hadith are interpreted. So, of course, as with anything where interpretation is available, there's a spectrum of how much or how little do we follow this interpretation. So kind of on the more conservative end, in order to avoid, the whole point was to avoid idolatry. Some Islamic art never depicts living creatures.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's why we see mosques decorated with these beautiful geometric patterns and calligraphy, sometimes plants, because there's an interpretation of the sacred text that is basically, in my really bad layman's terms, depicting living beings is Allah's prerogative alone. Like that is something only God should do. So drawing living beings is like saying you're equal to God. So that's where you get like the more conservative end. Like that is God's work. Only God is allowed to create living sentient creatures. And by making art with sentient creatures, you're saying you're equal to God. Yeah. And that is a no-no.
That's interesting. I didn't even know that. That's crazy.
Yeah. So that's like the super strict side, but there is like another end of the spectrum, because in history, we do have depictions of people and animals in Islamic art. But it's more in the secular art. It's not in the religious art. So as long as the there's other interpretations. It's like, as long as the art is not showing divine figures, like Allah or prophets, then it's okay. So, like, as long as it's separated from religion. So of course we have that spectrum of like, just to completely avoid it, don't do it at all ever. But then there is secular art out there that has animals and people in it. So you've got both sides of the spectrum. To wrap that up, tangent over. If you look up the art on these cards, now you'll have like a vague idea as to why the Mamluks playing cards don't show people on the court cards.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's super cool deep dive. Thanks for deep diving that, Anna.
Yeah. But how'd they get to Europe, Ruth? How'd they get all the way up there?
Anna, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you about that. So somehow, some way, these cards made their way into Europe. They came through Venice, Italy, because of the bustling trading economy that was happening there at the time. So we know that they made their way to northern Italy because there were actually also a lot of laws banning the use of playing cards in general. Most likely because cards would be used for gambling. I think in addition to most esoteric practices, gambling is also just been a fact of human nature since the beginning of time. And once playing cards were introduced, that kind of just ratcheted it up, you know?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. People are going to bet on stuff. It doesn't matter if it's cards or dice or...
Addiction finds a way.
Addiction finds a way. Yikes.
So anyways, definitely important to stress that they weren't used for divination officially at this point.
Yes. Okay, good to know.
So around the mid-1400s, Italian artists began painting additional cards that were heavily illustrated that could be added into existing decks. And by the 1500s, the Italian aristocracy was enjoying a game known as Tarocchi Appropriati. So in this game, players were dealt random cards and used thematic associations with these cards to write poetic verses about one another.
Okay, so before you move on, I just want to give my initial impressions of this game, because it kind of sounds like to me either a really overly complicated icebreaker at a staff retreat, which sounds terrible. In my personal opinion.
That's incredible.
You know.
Yeah.
Or like, we said like write poetic verses about one another, which also makes me think rap battles. Now, I know you're going to clear this up in a minute about what they really mean, but I do want to mention that rap battles do have a little bit of an extra history, because if you do play video games, and if you don't, it's okay. In the video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla, there's a mini game called Flighting with a Y, not an I. And that is based on a real poetic competition from the 15th century, and is basically old school rap battles. Like, you'd have to insult the person you're going against.
That's hilarious.
Secretly, I want you to tell me that Tarocchi Appropriati is just another version of this, but
yeah,
I won't hold my breath.
Well, there is a lot of debate to what exactly this game is, because we don't have like a rule book or a set of instructions anywhere. We're kind of just going off of intuition here and what was popular at the time. So these cards were often referred to as sorts, meaning destinies or lots in Italian, obviously. And it's kind of like that sleepover game MASH. Have you ever played MASH?
Oh yeah, I definitely played MASH. I definitely got Shaq a couple of times as the house that I would end up in.
Nice.
Okay, so when we're saying like Tarocchi Appropriati was used to write like poetic verses about the person being read for, it's less like a rap battle. You're not like slamming anyone, and it's more just like statements about how their lives will turn out.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, like, if we're going off this MASH theory, basically MASH would be used to, like, it's a paper and pencil game that you and your girlfriends would play at a sleepover to, like, predict your futures. So you put MASH on the top of the paper, and then you have categories like number of kids, your career, your future husband's name, and you'd fill out 3 answers for each category. Then you pull a card from the deck. So, this is when the deck kind of comes into play. You pull a card from a deck and you say you pulled 5. The number 5 is on your card. You would count through, and every 5th entry would get eliminated. And you'd work around your page until all items are crossed off in a category. And once an item is crossed off, it is not counted again. So that's out of your running. If you wrote like, my future husband's name is James, and I got crossed out,
Mhm.
then James, sorry, it's
Sorry,
not James.
It's not.
R.I.P.
Rip.
So
Sorry,
then you'll
James.
circle the last you'll circle the last remaining items in each category, and that will be the answer for that category. The writer will then read the other player's future aloud. So, for example, Becky will say, I'm going to live in a mansion in California, married to Mike with 2 kids. And that's their future. So that's kind of the gist of Cherokee appropriati for you. But I agree with you. The rap battle version, maybe we should just start our own rap battle duo. We can rap battle each other.
Next up, we're actually changing this to a rap battle podcast using the cards.
Yes, exactly. Yep. Anyways, so wealthy families in Italy commissioned these expensive and artist-made decks, and the oldest tarot decks were actually given as gifts to noble duke and duchesses, which I think falls in line with the popular myth that you cannot purchase your own tarot deck. It needs to be a gift.
It's really interesting to me that that's a superstition. It sounds like we don't have like a for sure origin, but that seems like a plausible one that you shouldn't buy your decks, which by the way, I don't believe in. I've bought so many decks for myself.
I know. I would not know what tarot is without purchasing my own deck. I don't believe in that either. But, you know, as far as historical precedents, we don't have much for that myth. But I think vibes-wise, if we're just going off of vibes, it's similar to when, like, I don't know if when you first got into psychedelics yourself, but a lot of people always told me, never buy your own mushrooms. That is like a guaranteed bad trip.
I have never heard that in my life, and I think it's
What?
wild. Yeah, no, that is the first time I've ever heard
bad
of this.
voodoo.
This sounds like something someone uses when they don't want you to like participate in a thing. It's like, oh, you can only do it if basically you're invited. It sounds like old school gatekeeping, and I don't like it.
Yeah, like let's make it more exclusive. So like when you do get a tarot reading, it's more spookier.
Exactly. It like heightens the whole like spooky mysticism, mythology behind it. So you like put more weight to it in your mind because you're like, well, I can't do it unless I'm invited. It's so exclusive.
That's so true.
But it does sound like you had to kind of be rich back then to get some of these decks because that cost some money.
Exactly. So the cards for the rich would be individually handmade, which is the exact opposite of what the poors would get.
Oh, the poors.
The poors. It's all right. The poor's decks would be made with like a large sheet of paper and woodcuts, and then there would be paint and stencils on these. So they'd be less like individualized and more, you know, mass produced, though we don't have the printing press quite yet. It is important to stress that even still, these cards have not been called tarot cards yet. They were called Carte de Triomphe, or Cards of Triumph in English. Despite not being called tarot cards yet, these cards were marked with suits of cups, swords, coins, and polo sticks. So, still similar to the Mamluks.
And still polo sticks.
Still polo sticks.
Still polo sticks.
Those will be changed to staves or wands eventually, but not for a while yet. These cards made the switch to being called tarot cards once they were later incorporated queens and trumps. Trumps are basically what we now consider the major arcana.
Totally forgot we don't even have the major arcana yet. It's still just what we consider today the minor suits.
Yep, minor suits and only 3 court cards. And once the trumps were added, we officially started calling them tarot cards. So we finally turned the corner.
Finally, after hundreds of years. But now I have, of course, more questions, as always. Do we know when or who like first incorporated the trumps and queens? Or is there any kind of like record of at least like an early version that has those things?
Well, I'm glad you asked. There basically have been 3 luxury tarot decks that have survived from the mid-15th century. And one of those decks is thought to have been made for Filippo Maria Visconti, the last Duke of Milan.
All right. Okay. Luxury deck.
And so while the Visconti tarot deck is the oldest surviving tarot deck, it was not the first tarot deck. The Marziano tarot deck was the first. It was conceived by Marziano da Tortona The deck was originally created for the same owner of the Visconti tarot deck, Filippo Maria Visconti, the Duke of Milan, and this was because Marziano da Tortona was Visconti's secretary, tutor, and astrologer.
I feel like people were able to be more things at the same time. I don't know. It just
Right.
sounds so whimsical to be like, I'm a secretary and your personal astrologer and a tutor all at
Right.
the same time. It seems like Visconti was super into tarot. It seems like, yeah, it's like all these like decks that we have record of were commissioned by him. That's super interesting.
Yeah, he seems to be a bit of a fanboy for tarot, which we
Love it.
appreciate. So the original cards from this Marziano tarot deck were lost to history, and the only evidence we have that it exists is because of a letter written to Queen Isabella Lorraine by Jacopo Antonio Marcello in hopes that he could win her favor. In the letter, Marcello described a deck that he was acquiring for the Queen, and this is the oldest known deck to have the trumps, so the major arcana.
Ooh.
And therefore is the oldest known tarot deck.
Are we finally getting to something like similar to what we use today, or?
Technically, we aren't to the point of divination yet.
Yes,
but
good to note.
we are, closely resembling tarot as we know it today. So the deck consisted of 4 suits, each with 10 pips and a king and a queen in the suit. The suit symbols were 4 different birds: eagles, phoenixes, turtle doves, and doves. Which
Okay, that
I don't
doesn't
think
sound-
I've ever seen a tarot deck. Yeah,
No.
I haven't seen
This
a tarot
actually
deck that has
sounds-
suits for birds. Birds and suits.
Super into birds. That's very interesting and doesn't sound anything like the tarot decks we're used to.
Yeah, so according to Marziano, who wrote in great detail about the symbolism of the deck in the letter, each suit was intended to represent a life goal or desire, and was grouped in 2 contrasting pairs. As previously stated, the deck also contained 16 trumps composed of classical gods, which was not an unusual subject in Renaissance art. Besides forming a separate trump suit, 4 gods were assigned to each suit, with the gods representing appropriate qualities for each goal. Does that make any sense to you?
No, I'm sure when I see it, it'll make a little more sense, but this sounds nothing like the tarot we're used to, aside from, once again, having 4 suits and some major arcana.
Yeah, so let me break down the suits for you. I'll break down what the suits are, what the suits represent, and which classical god was related to the suit.
All right, let's do this.
We have eagles representing the life goal virtue, and they were assigned Jove, Apollo, Mercury, and Hercules.
All right, okay.
Then we have the phoenixes representing the desire for riches, who were assigned Juno, Neptune, Mars, and Aeolus. Which again, pronunciation, rough on my end. Forgiveness is necessary. So then we have the turtle doves representing the goal of chastity, and they were assigned Pallas, Diana, Vesta, and Daphne. Finally, we have doves representing the desire for sensuality, and they were assigned Venus, Bacchus, Ceres, and Cupid. There you have it.
I mean, it actually kind of sounds like a really cool deck, but way different.
Right?
Like this doesn't, I feel like we've almost gone like further away from tarot because of the completely different symbols that they're using in this deck.
Yeah, at least like our Anglo-American, version of tarot we have today. I wonder if it is still similar to a lot of like the French occult tarot decks out there. But we'll have to dive into it more. So apparently also in the letter, Marcello tried to quell any doubts the queen may have about this game becoming unbecoming for her to play. In the letter, Marcello brought up a rhetorical question said to the Duke, who was asked if playing card games are fitting for such a serious and virtuous man such as the Duke to be playing. The Duke's response was that, quote, "It is fitting if the game is equally serious and virtuous in the philosophy it presents, and he felt that this game met that standard." So, kind of to summarize, this dude was like, "Hey, queen, I'm getting you a super cool gift." And the queen was like, IDK, I'm not sure, seems sus. Is it even serious enough for royalty? And the dude's like, yeah, because this duke said that as long as you take it seriously, it is serious. And we're still not to divination, but even before divination came into play, the tarot decks have been under scrutiny as to whether or not you should
take them seriously or use them at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, we don't know exactly when tarot cards officially started to be used for divination purposes, but I think we can all agree that magic is going to magic. And we know that people have been using playing cards for divination purpose, also called cartomancy, as early as the 14th century. And in Marziano's letter, he was very concerned with the symbolism and use of birds in the deck. And birds actually do carry a bunch of prophetic meaning and were used for divination in ancient Rome. So this does suggest that besides, like, you know, a MASH style game, Marziano may have intended a divinatory use for the deck he was giving to the queen.
Super cool. Also explains a little bit more about why all the suits were birds in his version of the deck. And I kind of know a little bit about birds having prophetic meaning in a few other, you know, pagan religions, but I do want to hear a little bit more about this bird magic.
Yeah, so it's called augury, and it is a practice from ancient Rome, the religion of interpreting omens from the observed behavior of birds. When the individual, known as the augur, interprets these signs, it is referred to as taking the auspices.
How auspicious.
Indeed.
Oh my gosh. Well, now we know where that word comes from. No wonder auspicious. Right. Yeah. That's super interesting. I mean, once again, that just feels like another episode. I want to learn how to read birds.
Oh yeah. I would like to be best friends with the birds. Birds, tell me your secret. Birds, write into info@mysticfooltarot.com and let us know your secrets.
Come on, birds. Let's be friends. Okay, but how did we actually get to divination with tarot?
Historical precedents for tarot taking a turn towards the occult came around the 1700s. The Tarot of Marseille is a deck that is considered to be one of the gold standard tarot decks even to this day, and it was very popular in France in the 17th and 18th century, and was most likely created in Milan before spreading to France, Switzerland, and northern Italy. And this was the deck that led to the occult use of tarot, the Tarot de Marseille.
Whew, we did it. Okay, so we finally made it from playing cards to occults. But I feel like there's still probably a good chunk of history to go through before we even get close to some of our more well-known decks that we use nowadays. Is that right?
Absolutely. Anna, if there's one thing this podcast is, as we go through this first episode, it is dense, and it is about to become denser. Even denser.
We love the twists and turns of the history of all of this.
So it wasn't until the 18th century that a Frenchman named Jean-Baptiste Alliette wrote a book linking tarot cards to divination.
I love the enthusiasm with which you pronounce these names. I feel like it makes up for anything that we accidentally mispronounce.
I am absolutely trying my best, but I'm just a girl from Montana trying her best.
That's all anybody's asking, right?
Right. The year was 1789, and great revolutions were stirring in Paris, and Attia, a pseudonym for the French occultist Jean-Baptiste, applied for a patent to print his book titled Livre de Thoth, which is French for Book of Thoth.
All right, I want to pop in here and mention de Gébelin. I'm going to apologize. I didn't take French in high school. So we just mentioned in 1789, Alliette published a deck specifically for divination. And in that same decade was de Gébelin. I'm so sorry, y'all. De Gébelin published a collection of essays in 1781, so 8 years before. And this collection of essays was very similar to an encyclopedia. And one of the essays was about tarot. Now, de Gébelin claimed that the tarot held secrets of the Egyptians and the wisdom of Thoth. And I mean it when I say he had no historical basis for these claims. Like, he just wrote an essay one day after seeing the cards.
We love the confidence. I think we could all benefit from tapping into that same confidence he had.
He had the audacity, quite frankly. So I just want to give a little context as to why we definitely know he had no historical context for what he wrote in that book or in that essay about tarot. The Rosetta Stone, that magical artifact, that was the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. That stone was found in 1799, a little more than a decade after Djebelin published this essay, and 9 years after Etienne published his divination deck. And on top of that, so that stone was our key to deciphering hieroglyphics, but just because we found it didn't mean that we like suddenly knew what all the hieroglyphs meant. There was still work to be done to translate it. Egyptian hieroglyphics weren't deciphered until the 1820s. So I just really want to impress upon you, like, if you're like, I don't know if I can apply for that job, I don't meet all the credentials, the audacity. These people wrote books. These people wrote books with zero historical context or prior knowledge or even actual deciphered Egyptian texts and just made these claims and published these books.
That's incredible.
Bold moves.
Atia's book promised to reveal the theory and practice of ancient Egyptian magic through tarot. By July, when the French Revolution began with the storming of the Bastille fortress, scores of Parisians were already turning to Atia's cards to divine the fate of France.
All right. We love that. We love that. He made some more claims about what his book would do without any.
If there's one thing Atia is going to do, it's going to be making some claims.
We love that.
So anyways, in his book, he assigned meaning to each card, leaning on astronomy and the elements, as well as supposedly taking inspiration from the Egyptian Book of Thoth. Atia claimed that the tarot was created by a group of 17 magi under the direction of Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical figure who we'll dive into in our next episode about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Atia wrote in 1783 that he calculated that the tarot was 3,953 years old and originally called the Book of Thoth. He also assigned a specific order and a spread to the cards that continues to be used today.
Wow. All right. I'm coming in with another sum it up section. So,
sum it up.
Djebelin and Atiye made a lot of unsupported claims about where tarot came from and specifically decided Egypt was where it came from. There's a little bit of context for that because France was going through like a big Egypt crazy phase. They were like fanboying over Egypt. So we don't have actually any evidence that the meanings from the deck came from anybody else but their own personal interpretations of the cards because hieroglyphs hadn't been deciphered yet.
Yeah, just that.
Yeah, just that. Because I did want to add that there is a collection, if you're doing some deep dive Google searches, there is a collection of Egyptian texts that Egyptologists Richard Louis Jasnow and Carl Theodor Zauzik have called the Book of Thoth. It's, imagine when you found all of these ancient scrolls and artifacts, they have fragments and pieces of actual Egyptian texts that they have found and they were translating. And it's a collection of these. However, just want to put things into a timeline perspective. These two Egyptologists didn't identify these until 1995. So this is another thing where there are different uses of the word Book of Thoth, depending on where you're seeing it used, whether it's across esoterics and occultists versus Egyptologists and archaeology. There's going to be different uses of that phrase. So when you're casually doing your little Google search, you might get a wide variety of options. And many of them are not historically based. And some of them are, but mean something completely different than what the occultists and the mystics have told us they are.
Yeah, that's a solid point to bring up, Anna. Thanks for sharing.
I'm here to be the Debbie Downer, I guess. Is that my role?
No, you're not being the Debbie Downer. You're just speaking the truth. And some people hate the truth. I think Atia hated the truth.
Just wanted it to be cool. He wanted to make something fun. So what did Atia do?
What didn't he do?
Yeah,
besides lie? So Atia founded an organization specifically dedicated to the study of the esoteric tarot. The society was called the Society of Interpreters of Thoth. and this society started forming the systems of tarot and integrating astrology into it, thus refashioning the tarot deck as a tool for spiritual and mundane divination. So we're here, we've made it. Tarot is officially being used for divination.
It only took several hundred years before tarot cards were used specifically for divination. Glad we got here. Yep, we did it. You made it. Thanks for sticking it out.
There's absolutely no doubt that Atiya was the first to give divinatory meanings to the cards and spreads, and some historians actually consider him to be the first person to earn a living as a tarot reader.
All right. Okay. So now we're starting to see some of the professional side, quote unquote, come into play.
Yeah, full-time tarot daddy, that's for sure.
Full-time tarot. I need that on a shirt. We're going to have shirts after this.
Full-time tarot daddy. So Atiya created his own tarot deck, the very first tarot deck to be used specifically for occult purposes. In the deck, he considers the first 7 cards to symbolize the first 7 days of creation. However, Atiya's deck does have some interesting interpretations of the cards that differ quite largely from the interpretations that have been traditionally associated with the cards. For example, the 13th card, called Marriage, is almost identical visually to the classic depiction of the Hierophant, despite the card being associated with the lovers. Card 18, the Traitor, can visually be identified as the Hermit, but its attributions are more appropriate for the Hanged Man. So a lot of differences from, the tarot deck he created to what we now consider traditionally the tarot cards to be.
Wow. I mean, my brain is officially scrambled from all those crossed wires. And we haven't even gotten, like you said, to the most common Rider-Waite-Smith deck, or even Crowley's deck. Like,
yeah, listen,
it's a trip.
Are truly, I feel like we need one of those detective walls with the red string where we connect everything.
I was very close to making
one.
one.
Jumping through some hoops. Yeah, right?
Yeah, they must be so flexible with how many back bends and gymnastics they're going through to get to these places. It's wild.
Absolutely. Yeah, tarot cards and their meanings have changed enormously over the years. When I first started diving into making my own tarot deck, I learned just how drastically some of the major tarot decks have switched their meanings or their card numbers, or even just visually over the years. And it also seems like almost counterintuitive to do that in a way. Just like if you're going to do that, just make an oracle deck at that point. But I mean, truly the only thing, as we learned through this history, the only thing that makes a tarot deck is the fact that it has a major and a minor arcana and some court cards. And so artists and authors kind of have full reign to change whatever they want, as long as they're working in those confines, it seems.
Yeah, it actually makes it a little less daunting, the idea of making a tarot deck, once you kind of go, oh, it's changed so much that you can make it mean kind of whatever you want, as long as you're keeping that structure.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely just comes down to the structure. Atiya's radical books elevated the tarot, enabling regular people to understand their fate and fortune. The present-day proliferation of tarot decks all trace their origins to this enigmatic French Egyptophile. Atiya, what a guy.
Atiya, what a guy. What an effect he had on tarot's history. Okay, so we've learned that tarot has had a long and complex history that spans several centuries and different cultures. The origins of tarot are not well documented, and much of what we know about the history of tarot comes from speculation and myth. The unsolved enigma of the genesis of the tarot definitely contributes to the inherent aura of mystery of these cards. And no doubt the tarot has a cultural significance that extends beyond its use as a tool for divination. While much is still unknown about the history and meaning of tarot, its enduring popularity and cultural significance continue to fascinate and inspire people all over the world. And I will continue to debate where these people get their claims.
Yeah, in the next episode, our little Tarot Tangents episode, short and sweet side stories, if you will, we'll get into some of the more popular origin story myths of tarot. There's just several different cultures that have, a history with tarot cards. So we'll dive into that more and kind of debate a little bit about, some of the popular origin stories. But I think we have a pretty good chunk of information to digest here today in this big long podcast. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed our first effort towards this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. And if you're a fan of the podcast, we do need some reviews so we can find new fans. So tell your friends and rate and leave a review. Follow us on our socials. Our handles are Sweet Death and Mystic Fool Tarot on all platforms, especially TikTok. So see you later.